community of people who are both artists and intellects with a very wide and influential network. So it's those people and that network that's brought me and us here to today. So Carl, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Erin. So today we are going to talk about what life might look like after the coronavirus crisis passes. Now we know this pandemic will eventually pass, but how likely is it that life is going to go back to exactly what it was before? We're going to examine some scenarios today, and well, we're doing this really to arm ourselves with knowledge about what to do to protect ourselves in the worst cases, how to benefit in some of the best cases. We're pretty much structuring this talk as a panel discussion where the panelists will talk about some of the issues that we are looking at, and it'll be followed by a question and answer session. So if you want to ask any questions, please type your questions and answers just into the Q&A on the Zoom, or if you're on the Facebook, you can just add it to the comment section on the Facebook. As we are going to be quite time sensitive and we want to get everything done quickly, we'll ask the panelists to keep their points brief, and so at certain times we might interrupt them to be able to keep to time. Erin?
Yes, just one housekeeping issue that I wanted to raise. Sorry, Carl. Is that there's been a lot of behind the work sort of reading and preparation. So what we've all done is between the four of us, we've compiled a list of, I think it's 12 documents that we've all found to be very useful and that we will to some extent be referencing indirectly or directly during this discussion. So we're going to put that in a Dropbox link and we'll make that available to everyone to read, just so you know that that resource is available. So that being said, let's introduce our panelists, and we can start with Mark Oppenheimer. Mark and I actually work together, and although I frequently disagree, find myself often rolling my eyes at some of what I think are some of his more extreme political views, he's definitely one of my favorite people. And I say that because he is a much needed combination between a lawyer and a philosopher. He's a profound, dedicated thinker, excellent communicator, and my favorite thing is that he does not back away from his core principles. So Mark, welcome, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Erin. Yes, so my background is in philosophy, and I have a sort of specialization in constitutional law. A lot of what I've been doing over the last couple of years has been looking at the difference between free speech and hate speech, with a mind of sort of combating genuine hate speech, which advocates hatred and incites harm, while making sure that the protection for free speech is quite large. Free speech is going to be one of those issues that I think we're going to have to deal with during this crisis, because we're seeing big restrictions on what people can say, and we're already seeing people being arrested for things that they've said. The other area of law that I practice is around protecting property rights. So I've done submissions to Parliament on expropriation without compensation, and take the view that now more than ever, protecting our economy and protecting property rights will become more vital, and that conversation still needs to be had now and after the crisis is over.
Great, thank you. And Mark, I don't know, Carl, if you want to introduce Mark
Yes,
Simonian.
well, I've known Mark for well over 15 years now, and he's also truly a profound thinker. His way of thinking is amazing at being able to cut through the noise and actually analyze clearly how the world works. Over the years, I've had many conversations with him discussing how the world, well, what the future of the world's going to hold, different scenarios. And now with the current crisis, I really think it's time that everybody else gets to benefit from his insights. So Mark, please introduce yourself.
Thanks. Thank you, Carl. My name is Mark Simonian. I'm actually coming to you live from the UK because my wife and baby and I, we live in Oxford right now. My current profession is I am training to be a philosopher myself. I'm in graduate school doing a master's right now. But in previous incarnations, I was, in my earlier phase of my life, I was a magazine publisher. I had a magazine in Boston that was based on Time Out in New York, or somewhat of the equivalent. And then in the second phase of my life, I was in finance, and much of that time as somewhat of a roving financier, roaming the globe and looking for opportunities and attempting to see the world from, as I say it, from an angle, so that I could get different perspectives on how the world works, where it's going, and try to coax out some of its secrets. I'm from Boston originally in the States, but I've lived 17 years in South Africa and still keep a home there. And I am trying to make sense of this crisis like everybody else. and it is a major one, and I think it's the largest, I mean, unquestionably the largest catastrophe since World War II, and definitely the largest I've faced in my life, at least on a global scale. But it could be even larger than that, and we just don't know yet, and we're still trying to figure it out and make sense of where the world and South Africa will be going after all this.
Great, thank you. So I just want to kick off before we get to the meat of it. I think it's important that we try and just get a grasp on what it is that we are dealing with as a society, both locally and globally. So the benefit of us having two philosophers here is that if anyone can tell us what it is that we're all grappling with from an existential perspective, it's you two. So Mark Oppenheimer, can you give it a go?
Sure. So we all know that we're dealing with a health crisis, and that we are trying to save as many lives as possible. We also know that the measures that are going to be taken to save those lives involve a trade-off. They involve trade-offs in a couple of ways. The one is economic. So we are having a global shutdown of our economy and of the ability for people to flourish in their work lives. And the other one is going to be social. So, when you cut people off and you isolate them, that is going to have ramifications. I think now is going to be an important time for us to reflect on what matters in life. What are those things that are genuinely meaningful? So the traditional answers to that are that the things that matter are those which are true, beautiful, and good. And now will be a time for us to try and exercise those values. So it's important for us to know what is actually true, for us to arm ourselves with the facts. Some people will have this opportunity to create beautiful works of art that in prior sort of epidemics throughout history, artists have taken the time to write great novels and produce great music on their own. So hopefully people do that. And then in terms of doing good things, there are going to be a lot of people that are become increasingly more vulnerable during this time. And now is the time to try and show as much love and consideration as possible, and for us to try and be as charitable as possible. So those are ways for us to internally find meaning and have a positive effect on others.
That I really love that angle. I love the fact that there's an emphasis there on community, and I think that that's a common theme that's going to keep coming through today. And I just like for all the panelists to keep this question of community and how we develop community in the back of your minds as you answer these questions, because I think that that is going to be fundamental for all of us individually and in business as we go forward, is reassessing this idea of community. Mark Simonian, would you like to give us a bit of an idea of how you define what we're grappling with?
Sure. First, I'd like to say that one thing I always go back to in these kinds of situations when life gets very, very stressful is, as the Chinese had said at some point, and I don't recall exactly when, but there was always opportunity in crisis. That said, as we both said earlier, this is going to be a very, very serious crisis. It is not a 3-week shutdown like a snowstorm or a small natural catastrophe and we get back to work afterwards. There will be repercussions and repercussions for years and years and years, and some of them will be very, very hard. I look at this like we are about to go into a world war, and it definitely has me concerned. But for me, at least in terms of my own psyche, when I go into a situation of great uncertainty, I try always to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So at this point, I think we'll end up probably digging into some of the worst case scenarios and seeing what we think is possible right now. So at least people can be mentally prepared for them and to start to guard against them so that their lives are well positioned to survive through and to thrive on the other end when we start to come out of this crisis.
Mark S., you are talking as though this is something that you see as being very long term. Can you please just comment on the fact that both nationally and globally, governments seem to be eschewing this narrative that as soon as we all come out of lockdown, things are going to revert to normal? Are we going to revert to normal? Is that nonsense? Should people, and how should people be evaluating that narrative?
Sure. But first of all, I would take anything that a government says with a slight grain of salt. Cyril Ramaphosa has done an excellent job as one of the best jobs of any world leader in preparing his country for this crisis. And with all due respect to him and anybody else, including Boris Johnson in the UK or Donald Trump, they're going to say what they know at the time, and also they're going to say what they think is going to keep the population as calm as possible. A 3-week lockdown is very unrealistic in my mind because, for one, the path of developing a vaccine or a cure is a long path, and it can't easily be abbreviated because vaccines require human trials, and one has to observe for after effects after a vaccine has been trialed, and that takes a considerable amount of time. So in other words, if a company or government develops a vaccine to cure the coronavirus, we will have to observe a population to see that it does not cause another disease or cause some other problem in their health before we can roll it out into the public. The best case scenario I've seen from the scientists I trust is somewhere around 18 months minimum. With that said, that means we will be either in rolling lockdowns or severely restricted, at least for 18 months. So I'm planning on that as my best case scenario, that we're going to have to deal with 18 months of our lives being uprooted. 18 months of lives being uprooted can do a tremendous amount of damage on the economy and on people's lives. And so at that point, we will no longer be fearing the disease, but we'll be fearing all the after effects. So there's a lot to be concerned about there.
So Mark, looking at this threat to the economy, I mean, people have been, where the governments look at, say, 3 weeks, a lot of the estimates I've said is the lockdown's got to be 3 months. Assuming now we say you've got lockdowns and rolling lockdowns or some type of social distancing going on for 18 months, just how serious can this economic damage actually get?
Mark, so is that for Marco?
Yeah, Mark Simonian, yeah. How bad can this actually get?
It's very unquantifiable. We're in virgin territory right now. The only comparison we could probably make in the modern era is to a world war. Mass dislocation, enormous impact on both developed and emerging markets. Businesses that do not have very, very strong balance sheets and are not in somewhat crucial industries could be destroyed. It's a storm that we just don't know yet. We're still in the very, very early days of it. I cannot even begin to answer your question other than it will probably be major.
Okay. And Mark Oppenheimer, then, with South Africa's socioeconomic conditions, where you've got so many people living in crowded townships and all the problems we've already seen, how feasible is lockdown to still, can we actually carry on and lock down South Africa like we needed to actually save the lives that all the medical experts say we need to do?
So Thomas Sowell famously said that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think it's important that we bear that in mind. So the one is you take a total priority on saving lives now, in which case you implement the strongest possible measures so that people don't infect each other. But that will have consequences. It'll have economic consequences, which will then feed into social and life consequences. So not only will we destroy a quality of life if people are driven into poverty, but that in of itself will lead to a loss of life. So what we then have to do is think about the trade-offs. We have to start working out what kinds of measures are going to be reasonable measures so that we can allow an economy to continue during this time. And that's going to be a sort of reflective exercise. We're going to sort of err throughout that process. We're not always going to get it right. And we're going to be looking at international sort of systems and see how they work. But we must also recognize that you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution, that our conditions in South Africa are very different to those in Europe. So we will have to sort of take that into account. One thing that is sort of, that we must bear in mind is it's not only a vaccine that may see us through this, but also treatments. So at the moment, it's unclear which treatments are going to work. There's some early thoughts about hydrochloroquine, but we haven't sort of got enough data to determine whether that'll work. But if you think about why we're having lockdown in the first place, it's to flatten the curve. So what does that mean? It means we're trying to avoid the number of cases getting so numerous that they overwhelm the healthcare system. And so what you want to do then is if you can pass people through that healthcare system more quickly, one way to do that is if you've got improved treatment. So people are spending less time in hospital, or you've got more available resources in terms of hospital beds, ventilators, ICU beds, and staff. That's going to make a difference. So one of the things that's happened in the Western Cape is that they've used this time to turn the convention center into a field hospital, because they foresee that once the numbers grow, there will be a need for excess beds. Similar things have happened in the UK, that conference centers have been turned into field hospitals. So one way to sort of deal with the problem is to raise the bar, if you think about that graph, which is to improve the amount of resources available. But we have to keep our eye on the economy. I'll give you an interesting case to think about. So if you think about a restaurant that operates, it might be able to tolerate a certain amount of reduction in sales for a while. So if it goes 10% down, it'll survive, 20% down. But once it, let's say, hits 30%, it's not that it operates at 70%, it just fails. So there are certain businesses that will cease to exist because we've cut them out of the economy for a certain period of time. And that will itself have a ramification. So those businesses that interact with other businesses, there'll be a sort of ripple effect. And so we've got to be very concerned about the economic contagion.
Well, that's almost the question that so many people are so scared about now. We have business owners asking, what about my business? The people that work, will I have a job? Entrepreneurs, freelancers, we know have had no work, and they're not sure when work's going to happen again. They're all thinking, oh, okay, we'll get work once it's all over, but if it's not over for a long time, how are they going to literally eat? I mean, Mark Simonian, what do you think people like that should be doing or worrying, and how do they prepare for this if we're looking at some of these worst case scenarios?
It's really going to depend upon the kind of business that somebody's in and what their financial situation is. Let me digress a little bit and try to give some ways of thinking about this. I spent a lot of time in survival school, and we think about hierarchies of what we need to take care of first. And of course, in a pandemic such as this, the first thing is to take care of our health and the health of our families. In survival school, they say shelter, water, fire, food is a sacred order, because you can live, basically, let me try to simplify this even more. You can live 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 months without, 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. We need to prioritize all the areas of our life that are fragile right now, from personal security all the way to bank accounts to our businesses. But I guess in short, I can't really answer that question if I don't know the specifics of somebody's business. But I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if somebody doesn't have enough money in the bank to survive 6 months of closed, you're probably going to have a very hard time.
So, Mark Oppenheimer, what do you think somebody would be able to do about that in the situation that they're in now? Are they going to have to learn to be working, say, maybe a digital economy? As you said, people online, they can maybe still work. But what about the people that can't do work online? What about the majority of South Africans that literally have to be physically somewhere to be able to work? Are they literally going to be in that Harvard, the Harvard Kennedy School did a presentation where they said in emerging markets, it'll become a choice between 100% chance of starvation or 10% of dying of COVID. How is that going to come into effect maybe in South Africa?
Sorry, Carl,
yes.
If I can just interrupt there was a signal interruption there. Can you just repeat that quote that you took out of the presentation?
Okay, it was people in emerging markets will soon have to take the choice between a 10% chance of dying of COVID or 100% chance of dying from starvation. How does that apply now to those people, especially the more vulnerable people in South Africa, who have to be somewhere physically to be able to work and earn a living?
Yes, I think it's important to see this as an equation of sorts. There is a sort of a certain amount of rope that you can burn through. People are not going to starve, 3 weeks. But some of the economic decisions that are made now may lead to starvation down the line. I think what we've got to start thinking about are practical solutions. So some businesses, for example, have pivoted very quickly. So there's a site called Bottles, which delivered alcohol. In South Africa, it is illegal to sell alcohol. So very quickly they realized, well, we have a delivery service available and we have an online platform that allows people to select goods. let's just change the goods that we sell. So they've partnered up with Order In, and they're now delivering essential services around the country. We're going to find that there are certain things that are actually very labor intensive, which can hire people. So delivery drivers are going to become really essential during this time. And so a lot of people that would have been delivering in other areas, or are staying at home, are going to be called up in a workforce. The other thing that we might want to consider is that you might want to set up isolated manufacture plants so that you can ensure the health of your workers, make sure that they're not getting sick. And maybe what you want is that their residence is next to the factory, that you can set up beds and living premises next to production so that people can still contribute to the economy and be involved. The other thing we've got to think about is this artificial line that we've been between essential services and non-essential services isn't so simple. So all of those that provide essential services like groceries and healthcare require the services of those a layer beneath. So people in logistics companies who are going to need access to laptops, to a bunch of technical equipment, and they themselves are going to require services from people underneath them. So we can't just draw this neat line, and we're going to sort of see that we're going to have shortages and logistical problems if we try and maintain that. So what we need to have is smart solutions to ensure that those things can keep going during the crisis. So look, we have to accept that we are dealing with a knowledge problem as well. So you made mention of the sense of a 10% death rate. Now, what we've seen in some countries is exactly that high mortality. In the UK, we're seeing around 10%, in the Netherlands, Belgium, and in Italy. But we're seeing much, much lower death rates in other countries. And part of that is because we've got this vacuum of information. One is we don't know how many people actually have it. What we know is the number of people who've tested for the virus. And so countries that have had greater amounts of testing are going to have a more accurate indication of how many people have it. The other thing that we're not sure about when we look at the death rate, we're currently comparing it to the number of known infected cases. It could be that there are many more infected cases. But the other thing we've got to bear in mind is that it takes a while for people to die. So it might take 14 days from someone to get it to death. So when we look at that death rate, we've got to compare it to the number of infected cases from 2 weeks ago. So actually our death rate might be much higher than we think. The other thing we've got to be concerned about is some groups seem much more vulnerable than others. So we know that the elderly and those underlying conditions are much more likely to die. But in terms of underlying conditions, one of them which has a high mortality rate is high blood pressure. Now, a lot of people may have high blood pressure without knowing about it because it's often asymptomatic. And so, it's quite hard to say only the vulnerable need to seclude themselves because not everybody knows their level of vulnerability. But as more information flows in, we will have better ideas about how to navigate our future economically and from a health perspective.
Mark, I'd like to pivot slightly off of a phrase that you used. You said that we have a knowledge problem. And I think that there are numerous kinds of knowledge problems that we face at the moment. One of them refers to a lack of data about the disease, but there are also other knowledge problems. And let me give you an example. There are a lot of small or medium enterprises at the moment that are facing closing their doors. You would probably find that in reality, a fair amount of those have options open to them to pivot in respect of their business models. But you will also find that some of them may not actually be aware of that or may not be thinking about it because they are not experts in marketing, or they are lacking certain other kinds of knowledge. And then you may have someone else who is a marketing expert who has this kind of information that can actually literally save businesses, which, as you've said, eventually down the line saves lives. So is there room in this economy for the creation of a new sector, one that actually bridges the gaps in knowledge to try and sustain these businesses and these other small enterprises? So I don't know if you can maybe address that.
Yes, well, something that Mark Esser said earlier, which is that a crisis creates an opportunity. And I think those people that are adept at working out how do you prosper during a time of crisis will do very well. And that's a good example of that, which is that if you've got people who can work together under the new conditions and work out how to be profitable together, that's one way of solving the problem. So I imagine that there will be traditional businesses that can be saved if they're able to come up with greater solutions, and they might not know what those solutions are. It'll be useful for them to partner up with others. So I think a lot of that stuff will happen organically. So what we're finding, we are in an incredible age of information where it's quite possible for people to spread ideas very rapidly. And so I think if I was in a struggling business, I'd want to be thinking about, well, what can I do to either pivot away from my business, or what can I do to change some of the underlying conditions of my business so that I can prosper during this time? What's interesting is if you look at some of the most successful businesses, they started off producing totally different products. So those that are around my age will know about Nintendo, which produced lots of video games. They started off as a tire manufacturer 100 years ago, and they did something completely different. And you find a lot of tech companies sort of realize the thing that they started doing doesn't work anymore. And if they pivoted and changed something that does work, they could be successful. And what we'll find during this time is a period of creative destruction, that a lot of people that aren't able to adapt will die. And hopefully enough people will work out how to adapt, because as you say, it's not just an economic question, it's a matter of saving lives. We need a sort of economy that can operate and can keep turning the wheels. If you think about, if you turn your car off for a while, if you turn it off for a week, easy to restart. Turn it off for a year, it's not going to restart. It's dead. So there is some point in time where everything will fail. And once that happens, we're then starting to look at other kinds of consequences. So we'll have massive social strife. You're going to find, people sort of operating outside of the law for their survival. So you'll have increases in violence and theft and destructions of property, and a kind of authoritarian pushback from the state. So those are the kinds of things that we want to avoid.
So I want to push that point a little bit further and talk about this question of pivoting, because inherent in what we've just said now is basically this notion that we're putting a burden on the people who have to pivot. In other words, we're saying there are people whose businesses are going to close, and those are the people who should be looking at pivoting. What about those of us who are privileged enough not to have to pivot? In other words, those of us who can survive and will probably, be able to continue business as usual in some or other respect. Do we have an obligation to change the way that we conduct our businesses to make sure that we advance greater equity, greater justice, greater opportunity in society? Or are we justified in being selfish and continuing business as normal if we can afford to do so?
So if you think about Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, he says, when the baker bakes bread, he doesn't do it so that he can, make sure that people's empty bellies are full. He does it for his self-interest. The magic of an economy is that people act totally self-interestedly to the greater benefit of everyone. That often it's the case that direct altruism doesn't lead to the good consequences that you'd expect. So there's a lot to be said for people, working out how can they best serve their own private interests, which will necessarily then serve other people's interests. So if you work out how to make sure that your business still operates, it is operating for the benefit of other people. So look, there's a separate kind of charitable question, as I mentioned earlier. Just because you're going to operate in a business for the intent of serving yourself, it will have these beneficial consequences. But that doesn't mean that you can't do things that are totally altruistic, like donating money to charity, or offering your services for free to those that need it. But that doesn't necessarily mean we need to change the way that our economy is structured.
Mark S., do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, the way I look at it is in terms of circles around us. We look at the immediate need as ourselves to make sure our own health is good so that we can provide for the people around us that we love, our immediate family, our children, and then our close friends, our community, and it goes further and further out than eventually our state and eventually the whole world. But we need to make sure under times of great stress that first we take care of our own personal needs and we make sure ourselves and our family are stable. And that sometimes takes a little bit of regrouping. But if we don't also reach out and get involved in our community, not only do we lose out psychologically, but we can also lose out physically. We have to be part of a community now. We're going to go through a tremendous amount of stress as a community, and people who isolate themselves and decide to ride it out alone, I think they're going to miss chances to be able to survive better, but they're also going to miss chances to become a better person. There's another great saying in survival. It's that training trumps gear, but community trumps training. So with that, being part of a strong community is the most effective way to survive a great dislocation. And caring for others is probably the best way I know to take one's mind off one's own problems and to become a better person. So I would say it's a balance, and you're trading off two different needs, but you need to do both. And we will all be hit by it. There's nobody, or there are very, very few people who will be able to ride this out in private, other than maybe some very wealthy hermit on a farm in the middle of nowhere who doesn't socialize all that much, but even they may be affected. We just don't know how big this will get. Hope for the best, plan for the worst.
So I want to, and Carl, feel free to interrupt, because I know this is also a point that you find quite interesting. I was reading an article about the Huffington Post in Japan. They gave an example that they had planned a seminar before the COVID virus outbreak, and they were expecting 50 people. Before that event happened, there was the eventuality of the COVID virus, and they were then forced to host the event online. Instead of having this topic exposed to 50 people, what ended up happening was 300,000 people joined into that conversation. So as a result of this move over to having to do things digitally, there was this jump from 50 people to 300,000. And it seems to me that what's happened, although we're all very nervous about technology, is that we actually have an increased access to community, which seems somewhat ironic. But it seems like there's a greater access to online resources and an online community. How should people be leveraging that, and how can they leverage that?
So I think a couple of things. You're right. The communities are going to be different from how we traditionally conceive of them. We're going to have these online communities that, where you live isn't going to be as important, because you can access everyone around the world. So there'll be those sorts of, often be useful for sharing ideas. But there's another sense in which physical communities are going to be able to play an important role. So I think we have to understand that states have a limit on how much they can do to address a crisis, and that communities can play an important role in assisting. So for example, around the construction of field hospitals, communities may be best placed to assist in that, because they know who has the resources inside their community to build the beds, set the structures up, which spaces are available. And I think that we're going to need much more cooperation between, the state, business, and civil society during this time, that it cannot be done by one of those pillars. All have to try and work together. I think the other thing that's going to be important for individuals and communities is keeping a vigilant eye on the state. So I've just written a report which logs the rights in our constitution that are currently being limited by the regulations that have been passed. Now, we haven't declared a state of emergency in South Africa, so our Bill of Rights is still in effect. It can only be limited to the extent that it is just and reasonable in an open and democratic country. So, for example, on the question of freedom of movement, we're seeing that there's an international consensus that stopping people from interacting with each other physically is a very useful way of saving lives. And so we may think that that restriction on movement is going to be reasonable in the circumstances. But there will be other kinds of restrictions that go beyond that. And it's important for us to be able to at least log them for now, that we can work out which of those restrictions are too pernicious, roll back immediately, and also to ensure that once the crisis is over, because it will be over, at some point in time, we will enter a new world. It'll be changed by the crisis, but we're not going to be in this forever. And at that point in time, we don't want to be living under an authoritarian state. We want to make sure that our freedoms are restored to us so that we can get back to flourishing. I'll make it available in the Dropbox folder.
Yeah, I think, Mark, that you've just touched on something that is fundamentally important. And I want to refer to what I think is probably the most important phrase that I have heard in the last 10 days. And it doesn't come from South Africa. It comes from Lord Sumption. And for those of you who are watching who are not sure who that is, he is an ex-Supreme Court judge in the UK. He's one of the UK's foremost jurists and intellectuals, and he's also a historian. But earlier, I think it was this week or last week, he said the following, and I'm going to quote it. He said, "When human societies lose their freedom, it is not because tyrants have taken it away. It is usually because people willingly surrendered that freedom in exchange for protection against a threat." I think that those words are exceptionally profound, and they concern me very deeply in regards to South Africa. And I will give you an example, is the fact that, you know, for example, we are being tracked and traced through our cell phones. This is something that's attracted very little criticism, very little attention, but it is a massive infringement. But there seems to just be this mass acceptance that government is doing what is best, and therefore we just surrender our rights. We give everything away. Another big problem is the fact that we live in a democracy, and that means that, you know, when the president and his ministers take decisions, there's supposed to be oversight by Parliament. We've heard the Democratic Alliance tell us that Parliament is not functioning, it's not able to perform its oversight functions. So we are in a position where, as far as I see it, for all intents and purposes, our democracy has stopped. Can you give us some comment and tell us what rights are being infringed that we should be watching out for?
Yes, sure. So one of the rights that's been heavily restricted is the right to free speech. So, for example, one of the regulations says that if you intentionally deceive people about the virus, efforts to address the virus, that is a crime punishable by 6 months in jail. And we have had an early arrest. So there is someone who produced a video claiming that the state would be sending around people to do testing at homes, and he thought there was a concern that those testing kits might themselves be infected with the virus, and then asked people to refuse the testing on that basis. Now, he has been charged. Now, I think under ordinary conditions, most people that care about free speech would say, well, what you find in the marketplace of ideas is that people will say things that are incorrect, and then we rebut them, and that truth will ultimately win out. Now, what's difficult, of course, is in a time of panic, people might be hindered at working out what is true, and we might have strong repercussions for people acting on false information. But we must be very wary of surrendering rights like free speech so easily, especially because what you find is that during the crises, states grow. A book called Crisis and Leviathan, written by Robert, which talks about how in states of war, people very happily surrender their rights, but states don't very happily grant those rights back because they like the power. You know, Bekele has already sort of made a number of comments about how it would be nice to ban alcohol generally after the lockdown because there's all these positive social benefits. So that sort of nanny state, a moralizing approach, you know, might gain traction during this time, but it's not necessarily a good idea going forward. So we have to be vigilant about that. The other kinds of things I've talked about this as being a time for opportunity. It's a time for opportunity for good actors and bad actors. So those that want power, so they can wield it over others to their detriment, will try and seize it during these times. So it's up to the good guys to sort of rally around the correct positions and push back. So, for example, as I say, one of the debates we're having in South Africa up until recently is this question about expropriation without compensation. In other words, denying people their property rights. Now, there were many reasons why it was a bad idea before the crisis, but it's an incredibly bad idea after the crisis. Our economy is going to be so much more fragile. You know, one of the things that Ramaphosa said, which is encouraging, is we're going to need to adopt pro-growth economic strategies. We're going to have to try and absorb a number of people back into the economy who've lost their jobs, which means we're going to have a lot less restrictions on labor laws. We're going to have greater protection of property rights. We have to try and recognize that the greatest driver of growth in the country is not the state, it is business. Business employs many more people than governments can. One of the ideas floated as a post-recovery measure is to spend 2 trillion rand on infrastructure projects. That's a very state-led approach. What we need to be doing is getting business back on its feet so that it can employ people. So those are the sorts of things we're going to have to think about.
Mark, I just wanted to comment here in terms of things like state-led approach. For South Africa to have 2 trillion rand, where will it get it from? We've always known that being a problem. And further with us moving more towards state authoritarianism, aren't there chances of actually serious political changes? I mean, what is the government actually going to do? They've got to take this decision between choosing between lives and the economy, and which ones, the division between that we've already spoken about. Plus, they've been given all this extra power. But how does that play out? You mentioned like how Cyril Ramaphosa's posing all these neoliberal policies, but he's getting quite a lot of pushback from other areas in the ANC and the tripartite alliance. I wonder if Mark Simonian can maybe just add a little bit more to this. What do you see happening in the politics here in South Africa? How is that likely to play out?
Sure. First of all, I think we have to acknowledge the backdrop that we're up against in South Africa, which is that South Africa just went into junk status in the 3 major credit rating agencies around the world. That puts South African economy in a very difficult position because their cost of borrowing money has now just gone up, and they're going to have a very hard time financing its needs going forward. So it gives South Africa a very restricted space to work within. Additionally, unlike the US and even Europe, South Africa can only print a certain amount of money before it can start moving towards hyperinflation. I know the US can also go towards hyperinflation. That is definitely also a risk because the US is also printing like crazy. But there's a lot more trust in the US dollar because it is the world's reserve currency. When South Africa starts printing it, can they get that proper line between just enough to save the economy and not too much that it spirals out into hyperinflation? I'm not confident that South Africa can manage that balance. So it's a very, very dangerous place they're going to have to go to try to solve this problem. Now, within that backdrop, we also have a war going on with the ANC over which direction it's going to go. At least Ramaphosa, we're not really sure which direction he's going in. We think he's neoliberal, and he is economy minister, is definitely leaning towards, definitely unquestionably a neoliberal. But he's also dealing with the tripartite alliance, which is very much about redistribution of assets. So ANC could go either direction in this crisis. We just don't know. It could be that Cyril Ramaphosa gets pushed out of office and there's somewhat of a palace coup in the party, or the party decides that his policies aren't working for the country, or we could go in a neoliberal direction. If we go in a neoliberal direction, that's going to mean probably that we go to the IMF for a bailout. And if we go to the IMF for a bailout, it's going to come with all kinds of strings attached that the economy has to reform itself. Specifically, state-owned enterprises are going to have to shed jobs. They have to be put in place all kinds of limitations on spending and on corruption. And it's something that the rest of the ANC may not accept. So right now, I would say that South Africa is on a precipice where it could go either direction right now. We hope that it's going to go in neoliberal direction because that's going to mean stability most likely for South Africa long term. But if it decides to go a confiscatory route for wealth, it means all bets are off. It means things could spiral in an entirely different direction. And many of the things that people held sacred in South Africa with regards to sacredness of their property and of their rights could be thrown out the window. So it's not in a solid position right now. It could go either direction.
So, Mark, I think you're right to say that we stand at this precipice and that the ANC is a party divided with different ideological positions. But this is where I think we need to sort of take on that mantle of being active citizens, that we can play a role during this time in influencing our direction going forward. So For example, one of the things that we've sort of seen changes in our regulations over time as citizens have expressed the concerns with those regulations. And I think we're going to see more and more online petitions pushing for certain agendas. We're also going to find that big civil society organizations that have the ear of government are going to play an important role during this time as well. That the Institute for Race Relations, for example, has put an enormous amount of effort into looking at different scenarios going forward and have offered a number of solutions. So I think it's quite important that people identify those organizations that are doing a good job, try and either support them by lending their ideas or lending their money. So the Institute for Race Relations, for example, has a friends network where people donate something like 100 Rand a month, and that keeps the organization going. And that organization is going to play an enormous role in securing South Africa's future. So I don't think it's a matter of, being passive citizens. We have a different kind of democracy given our conditions, but we still need to participate in it. And I think we can play a role in changing people's attitudes. And these sorts of conversations are part of that as well.
Mm-hmm. I would completely concur with you. And IRR is doing very good work, unquestionably.
Yeah, I think that this issue is a very important one, because the question of national politics and its direction is something that I think overwhelms a great many people. Those of us who are not directly involved in policy or in law often put our hands up and say, this is beyond us. We must react to it, not actively change it. And I would just like your comment on how important it actually is for businesses and individuals to get involved in this political discussion, and if you could maybe suggest some more practical mechanisms that they can do that.
Mark, I'm going to give this one over to you because you know much more about this than I do.
Sure. So I think we also have to sort of remember that we've had a backdrop of chaos in South Africa for the last couple of years. We've had lots of economic instability and political instability, and that business has been very quiet during this time. So, for example, on the question of expropriation or compensation, banks were quite quiet as to what they would do with their customers' mortgages. Some of them sort of said, well, if the state confiscates your residence, we are going to expect you to pay your mortgage because you signed a contract with us. So that at least gives South Africans an idea of where they stand. But I think those in business have typically, especially in big businesses, have tried to cozy up to government so they can suit their own interests. And now is the time to try and push back and work out what is unreasonable and offer solutions as well. So as I say, we can't go it alone. We can't surrender ourselves to the state. The state cannot possibly have all the answers. There's a great book written by Hayek called The Road to Serfdom, and one of the documents that I've shared with you is a sort of a comic strip version of the idea. And the notion is that during times of crisis, like a war, what we do is we surrender ourselves to central planners because they seem to have all the solutions. They tell us what we need to do. They direct factories to produce certain things. They close on other kinds of business, and that may very well be useful during the time of crisis. But after the crisis is over, the planners are still around, and they want to keep regulating people and they keep restricting people's rights. And I think that sort of ends up in these very dystopian societies, which we've sort of seen, in the form of communist countries like China, like Russia, like Cambodia. And there's a concern that given that we have organizations in South Africa that are very pro-communist sympathies. I mean, one member of the Tripartite Alliance is the South African Communist Party, that the EFF are an openly Marxist organization, that there will be moves towards nationalizing assets, towards total state control. And we know that that only ends in loss of life and misery. If we think about the costs of Spanish flu, to give you a sense of numbers, there's an estimate that the Spanish flu led to the deaths of 50 million people. We know that communism led to the deaths of 100 million people, that political ideologies can have very serious repercussions. And so, this is a time when, as I say, bad actors will use the opportunity to centralize their power, and that may have much worse consequences for us down the line. And so we need to be alert to that and resist it. And as I say, business needs to take the opportunity to stand up and protect itself and protect South Africa.
Can I ask you a question, Mark? If you don't want to answer this, I understand. But from a hypothetical perspective, I think a lot of people are, when you're talking about political actors, a lot of people are very curious about what's happening with the EFF. They've gone from being immensely vocal 24/7 to the point that no one can get away from them to basically being unheard of. So there's a lot of silence there. The question is, what do you think is being plotted? What do you think we are likely to expect from the EFF? And what is the time frame in which we should be expecting that?
Yeah, so the last I heard from the EFF was that they've started a book club, which is that they've recommended 7 texts to be read during the lockdown. And the texts are communist-style texts. So I suppose what they're doing is using the time to sort of work out what their core principles are. If we forecast down the line a little bit, and we think that there will be a hangover to the lockdown period, which in the form of an economic downturn and political instability, we may find that the ANC, for the first time in democratic South African history, dips below 50%, and that they're then going to need an alliance partner so that they can retain some level of control. And there will be a choice between the prodigal son of the EFF, Julius Malema was a member of the ANC Youth League, or a sort of, let's say, classical liberal-ish party like the DA. And so we may find then, if you had an alliance between the ANC and the EFF, that the EFF would then be able to utilize a lot of the stuff that it's planning on doing now, which is, a command-driven economy, stripping people of their assets, which would really plunge us into catastrophic conditions. We don't have to look too far back into history to see what happens when you do that. We can look up at Zimbabwe and the fact that they had the world's worst case of hyperinflation, that their currency, bought you with a truckload of notes, you could buy yourself a small quantity of tomatoes. And we also know that those policies haven't worked out very well in Venezuela and have led to starvation and suffering. So that is a genuine concern. And so, it's important that we try and guard against that kind of eventuality. I do think disseminating ideas is useful. I think the EFF have the wrong ideas. I think the idea of sharing resources is a good one. So, I applaud the fact that you can resources share with others. As I say, there are some excellent books that you can be reading during this time. One of my favorites is Mills on Liberty. It's very accessible, it's freely available, and talks about the correct role of the state in relation to individuals and the importance of things like freedom of expression. And it's a highly accessible text. So there is some time now for doing that deep reflective work.
I want to just follow up with one question and point on that. I share with you this love-hate for the EFF, especially in issues like this with their book club. As much as I'm not a fan of communism, I think that what the EFF is doing very well in that scenario is educating its followers and is interacting almost personally with its voter base, which I think is a very smart and actually necessary political move. And I wonder if other opposition parties are not failing by doing similar things in this time. And then if I could maybe just ask both you and Mark S. for your 3 top text recommendations for reading. I think that might be a good thing to do.
Well, if you want a sort of prescient documentary, you can read 1984, I suppose.
It's actually right behind me.
Yeah. So yeah, I think 1984 is going to give us a lot of lessons about state surveillance and state control. I think there are going to be, there's going to be some great works of literature that sort of give us that insight, and some accessible works of philosophy. I will send you a list of things. I would say The Road to Serfdom is a very accessible read, and Mill on Liberty are also really excellent.
And I would say, well, let's see, how would I go about this? If I had to give you 3 books right now, I'd say one of them, I don't know if it's the top one, but there's a book called The Mandibles by an author named Lionel Shriver. She's American living in the UK. And it's a dystopian novel about what happens in a Western society when that goes into hyperinflation. It's actually quite depressing. It's not a terrible portrait of what can happen. Also in that vein of what happens during meltdowns, there's a book by Barton Biggs, who's the chief, I think the chief strategist for Morgan Stanley a number of years ago. He recently died, and it's called Wealth, War, and Wisdom. And it's his study of what happens economically during periods of great dislocation. And he studied during World War II where wealth was preserved and where wealth was eliminated, and what kind of investments were safe, what kind of investments were not safe. And with that, he weaves a tale of what happens during these great crises and how people fare and where they move and all that. Again, slightly, well, not slightly depressing, definitely depressing, but at the same time, gives you a sense of what is possible. For a third book in front of me, stacking up my computer right now, one of the more interesting ones I've read recently by a philosopher named Simon May. It's called Love, A New Understanding of an Ancient Emotion. And it's a philosophical defense of how love works and why it's important in our lives. It's for the philosophically inclined. I need to warn you guys, but it's somewhat, it's accessible to a someone who's not educated as a philosopher, but it's a little bit on the more challenging side. But those are 3 ones. I could come up with many more if I had a little bit of time, but those are 3.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, just while we're here, I want to maybe touch on some of those questions from like Wealth, War, and Wisdom. For example, what is likely to happen to assets now, going forward? I mean, a lot of people are asking, should I buy a house? Should I sell my house? We're getting a lot of those type of questions. Everybody's asking, the markets have crashed. Are they going to bounce back up, or are they going to crash further? Are we entering into a long-term recession or depression or something like that? So, Mark Simonian, what do you think is likely to happen? What should they look at in terms of, what's going to happen maybe to like the property market in South Africa, different regions, and what assets should they look at maybe investing in, if not property or, the stock exchange?
Again, a difficult question because it depends upon everybody's individual financial circumstance, and what's right for one person is not right for another. What's right for me from this perspective is I believe for one time in the future one time in recent history that precious metals are probably a pretty decent place to have some investment in gold and silver. Just because we're printing so much money right now, it's devaluing the currency base, and people need some defense against it. My own personal financial activities in this crisis have been moving towards assets that are anti-fragile. Companies that specialize in online products and services. I give you one example is a company called Peloton based out of the States, which is they're a maker of high-end exercise equipment that is internet connected, and they're the leader in that field. And given all the crises that's going on in the world, there are still many well-heeled people that are now confined to their apartments and homes and want to feel part of a community. So this is a way of participating in an exercise community. But again, this is a very high-end product for a wealthy crowd, but it's something I believe there's a future in. And other companies that I've been involved in or looking at are companies that sell online goods that we're going to need during a period of lockdown. I anticipate this lockdown will be easily 2 years on and off, and it will change the way we operate from there forward. So people will be much more used to doing buying things online, doing business online, teleconferencing online, more of their life online. So things, I'm investing in those kind of trends. Also, I'm looking at things that have anti-fragile supply chains that are domestically based in the US, because I believe that a lot of the supply chains are going to be changed going forward. It's going to become very difficult for companies to justify having all their factory production in China. At very least, they will have to diversify around Asia so that they have less nation risk. But more likely, you're going to see a lot more onshoring of manufacturing, which is going to require major changes in the supply chains. And then, companies that are also more vertically integrated, that have things in-house, like a company like Tesla, which produces a very large portion of their automobile in-house that rely so heavily on third-party suppliers, to me looks very good going forward.
And just then, for most of our viewers here, their primary assets are generally property because they'll either be buying a house or not buying a house. What do you think the property market's likely to do in South Africa? How do you think that would be affected by this crisis?
It's a difficult one because no one can really say, but my own personal belief is that we're going to have a major real estate correction. I think we're seeing obviously right now because retail stores can't be open, restaurants can't be open. And also in a place like South Africa, we can't anticipate a major government bailout like you're seeing in the US or the UK or the EU. So middle-class owned businesses are probably going to go under at a significantly higher rate in South Africa. That's going to affect the property developers to a tremendous degree. I think we can also look at some of the fringes of residential property sector are going to be the worst hit most quickly. People like Airbnb hosts that own multiple properties and are highly leveraged after not having a season or so of renters may end up in a liquidity squeeze and have to divest. People who are, buy-to-let landlords that don't have very, very strong balance sheets that can't survive 6 months to a year of having their income upset are going to have to are probably going to have to put their properties back into the market. I think the people that are probably best equipped to ride through this crisis are going to be long-term landlords, probably multifamily landlords that have very strong balance sheets in prime property or prime areas. They can deal with a 3, 4, 5 year trough and everything be good in a few years. But anybody who can't survive a downturn for a period of time are going to have very hard problems, and that's going to have a big effect on real estate prices. And I also believe in African real estate prices, at least in places like Cape Town, not Joburg, are significantly overvalued when you look compared to the rest of the world. I look at Cape Town property prices versus Mediterranean property prices, and they're just about in line in a lot of areas. That seems to me quite excessive, considering that Mediterranean offers quite a bit, and it's more stable societies and more options of places to live. So I don't have high hopes for the Cape Town property market at this point. But Joburg, on the other hand, has been deflated over the years, so I'm not so worried about Joburg property other than Stanton.
Mark, Mark S. I'm finding this financial angle very useful, but I have what is probably a baseline question, which is this narrative that's been going around concerning South Africa's recent downgrade. Locally, it's been written off as being immaterial because of the global state of the markets and because of the virus. Is that accurate or not?
In my estimation, not being an economist and not being a specialist in IMF bailout packages, is that it is very relevant that South Africa has been downgraded. That's completely, I would completely discount the idea that it doesn't matter. South Africa, like most emerging economies and most developed economies, are going to be desperate for financing as a result of this lockdown. Now, if all of a sudden the 3-week period in South Africa, they're able to contain the virus and keep it under control in South Africa, and they're able to lock down, to keep the society in a low infection growth period for the next few months by shutting the borders. And then all of a sudden, at the end of that 2 months, we come up with a really good treatment protocol and this mass proliferation of testing. South Africa does have windows that it can come out of this smelling like roses. But if that doesn't happen, South Africa is going to need money. It's going to have to borrow money to get back on its feet like everybody else. And I don't see that money coming from Russia. And if that money happens to come from China, which has its own set of problems, they're going to ask for a pound of flesh in return. And it may be something more difficult for at least middle-class South Africans to stomach than what the IMF asked for. And let's keep in mind, what the IMF is going to ask for is going to ask for the South Africa to clean up the public enterprises, cut the wage bill, to clean up corruption, and just be more responsible with spending overall, and stop these ideas of expropriation without compensation, and just dial back on the whole idea of this redistributive economy. that's the price that the IMF ask.
Mark Oppenheimer, I'd really like your input on this same question about the relevance of the recent downgrade, and then also if you can just address the issue of whether or not expropriation of compensation without compensation is still an issue that you think we face, and whether or not the expropriation is limited to land or whether it could possibly include other assets as well, or other assets that are held by people like their investment or credit or whatever, also vulnerable to attack.
Sure, let me start with the second question first. So if you look at the proposal, the language was land and improvements. So an improvement on your land would be your house, a factory. It wouldn't be your car and it wouldn't be your investments. So it's sort of fixed property, but it's a large asset class. And that obviously would have ramifications. So in other words, if you start seizing people's homes and businesses, that would cause difficulty for the banks who've had their security taken. They might say, well, we expect people to repay their loans, but if you take away someone's business, they have no capacity to repay the loan. Now, what we found was that the IRR were incredibly prescient on this issue of EWC and COVID. When the first case came to South Africa's shores, it was the same day that Parliament had sent out a committee to KwaZulu-Natal to go and have public hearings. And they said, this is a terrible idea. Those hearings are going to lead to the spread of the virus. And they called for the hearings to be stopped. Government took a bit of time before it adhered to that, and it did stop the hearings at some point. So it is still an open question as to what will happen on that process. As I say, now more than ever, we need to realize that we cannot afford that kind of policy, that it would be immensely destructive to a fragile economy, and one that's going to be, much worse for wear after the lockdown is over. In terms of the downgrade, so there's two ways of looking at it. The one is that we might look relatively less bad because a lot of other countries are going to be economically downgraded. So everyone's sort of being shot in the chest and we're all bleeding together. But the problem with that is that we're going to be standing in that same IMF queue asking for a bailout. You're sort of, in other words, if it would be an option for us beforehand to say to the IMF, look, we'll mend our bad ways, we will stop being corrupt, we'll fix our SOEs, can we have some money, please? They might have said, sure, no problem. When you've got 50, 60 countries in that position, where's the money coming from? So it's not clear to me that we'll be able to borrow our way out of the crisis. Mark, you've raised something else which is very interesting, which is that the way that we think about global supply chains is going to change. So I've held the view for quite a while that with this interconnected global economy, it doesn't make sense for South Africa to have its own manufacturing sector if it can just import the goods very cheaply from China and India. That view must change. We know, for example, that India is in a lockdown. It cannot produce the same amount of goods. That specifically with regards to medicines and masks, we're going to have shortfalls because those countries can't produce enough for themselves, nevertheless the rest of the world. So we are going to find a sense of a shrinking in some ways, in that people retreat to their national boundaries and that they have to be locally capacitated. One of the things that's the debates we've been having for the last couple of years is about freedom of movement in Europe. Everyone thought the idea of the UK leaving the EU was insane. One of the first countries to close its borders was Germany. That we're going to find a sense of countries saying, well, we have to protect our own citizens. We can't have cross-border traffic. So that sort of freedom of movement debate has been superseded by events. And we may find that it's much harder for us to trade with each other for practical reasons. Look, the hope, of course, is that we're able to restore ourselves back to a functioning global economy. Economies work better when you can specialize, when those that are very good at one thing are able to trade their goods with someone else who's very good at that particular thing. But for a while, we might have to rely on our own internal capacities, and not necessarily just national capacities, but provincial. So in South Africa, we've locked down our provincial borders. You can't travel from Gauteng to the Free State for a very good reason. So we may find ourselves sort of narrowed into our communities and to our sort of physical locations in ways that we're not dreamt of before.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, we just got a couple of questions, and then we'll need to wrap up. But firstly, Maurice is just asking, once we are through this, how is the divide between the first world and the third world economies going to be? Is this likely to expand the divide? Make it richer countries better off than poorer countries? We don't have, the third world countries or developing economies don't quite have the skills that they have in the first world economies to be able to deal with that. I don't know, Mark Oppenheimer, if you want to maybe answer that.
I will put forward something that's kind of an intriguing proposition. So there's a paper that's been circulating looking at the effect of the BCG vaccine. That vaccine's purpose is to guard against tuberculosis. And what this paper does is say that it looks like there's some level of correlation between those countries that don't have full BCG and higher levels of death and infection. So, for example, Italy, Belgium, America, and the Netherlands don't have good rollout of BCG, and they've had very high levels of infection and very high mortality rates. What is interesting is that because the third world has had to deal with tuberculosis, that the levels of BCG have been much, much higher. So there's a site called BCG Atlas, and you can have a look at a global picture of how long that vaccination process has been in place for, and where in the world. Now, look, there are other reasons to be skeptical of that correlation. One is that third world countries are less likely to have received as much international travel. So places like Spain, Italy are big tourist hubs. Another reason why they've had bigger spikes in their numbers. Also, we have reporting problems. So as I alluded to earlier, just because a country tells you they have a very small number of cases doesn't mean that that's accurate. So North Korea and Turkmenistan have 0 cases as they report, but that's highly unlikely. It's more likely the case that their totalitarian governments aren't doing the testing work and aren't reporting the information. But we can look at countries like Russia, for example, that have had almost 1 million almost 1 million corona tests, and have had only 8,000 instances and very low levels of death. And Russia has had a very good adoption of BCG. So it is possible that one scenario we could look at is that the third world is better protected against COVID than the first world, and it may be able to weather the storm better. It's a possibility. We have information to do that evaluation. The other way of looking at it is that countries that have resources are going to be able to weather the storm. So the US, for example, has put in a $2 trillion bailout to protect its citizens and its businesses. In South Africa, government put 150 million rand in. So, an insignificant sum. And then it really sort of opened it up to wealthy families to say, could you please chip in a little bit into our begging bowl so we can try and help out small businesses? So we don't have the same resource to protect ourselves that the first world does have.
Okay, thank you. We also got another question from Deborah. South Africa is totally subject to the global power plays connected to the virus, and these players have designs on SA's resources and lands and people. Please, would your panelists share their opinions in the nutshell of what is happening on a geopolitical level, and perhaps which global interests they believe will sway SA's direction? And if you want to try that, Mark, Simonian?
In terms of which global organizations will sway South Africa's direction in the virus response, economic response?
Yes, in the virus response. So,
well, I mean, obviously everybody's looking at Germany right now because they dealt with the crisis so well. Angela Merkel has been the gold standard in Europe, at least, whereas Ramaphosa has been the gold standard in the rest of the world. Really, what it comes down to with this virus, if countries want to do well with it, what most of them are finally discovering is test early, test often. That's been the missing link in most countries. Here in the UK, it's been one of the big problems is that the testing capacity has ramped up very, very slowly. In fact, last Thursday, I think it was, only 2,000 healthcare workers in the UK had been tested by that. When you think of how long this virus has been along or how long you can have been aware of it, that's appalling. So yes, I think Germany is the gold standard. I think they will continue to be. Actually, well, Korea also in Asia was too before. China, we can say they've done a decent job, but they've also brought us the virus. So yeah, I think South Africa is taking direction from the best right now, and that's very, very encouraging. There are good things in South Africa right now, and there are negatives. And when we talk so dire and apocalyptic, sometimes it's we're looking at what can happen if these negative scenarios play out. We hope the positive scenarios will play out, but we just don't know yet. And there's just too much uncertainty at this point.
Thank you. Okay, Leanne's asking that since most first world countries are gearing up for online learning for students, providing the infrastructure and even the hardware where needed, realistically, that's not likely to happen in South Africa. So what can we expect from the education department in terms of catering for underprivileged children? Is there a chance these children will be held back for a year? Marco, I don't know if you want to try that.
So I can tell you a project I was involved in a number of years ago, which was to try and provide underprivileged schools with accesses to Kindles, so that they could access a whole bunch of materials online, great classical works, and that program has sort of been rolled out by government to about 1,500 schools. I'm not sure that I would recommend Kindle, because one of the things that's interesting in South Africa is the massive proliferation of cell phones. A number of websites are sort of zero data rated. So I think you can access Wikipedia, for example, without spending any money. It is quite fortunate that even the poorest of the poor have access to information and are able to educate themselves during this time. One of the things that we've sort of been talking about in South Africa for a while is this battle for free education. And in some ways, we have it, that there is so much information that is available for free online. And what you want is the ability for people to access it. One of the reasons why online learning often fails is because people lack the discipline and they lack the community support. So, for example, if you look at Unisa, Unisa's law degree only has a 2% pass rate. It's one of the hardest law degrees to get, whereas at UCT it was a 33% pass rate when I was there. So you kind of need a community of people to sort of engage with, and those communities are going to be online. And so I think we want to try and foster that. What we may find is another concern, that if you close schools down for too long, that people then drop out and they never go back. And that can have all sorts of negative consequences going forward. If people drop out of school, they drop out of a sort of a society and an opportunity to better themselves going forward. So it's definitely an issue worth keeping our eye on.
Okay, thank you.
Online learning is not optimal at a young age because it does require, as Mark said, the discipline. And a lot of why kids go to school at a young age is to develop a really good structure in their life that maybe they did not have in their home life. Culture and taste gets transmitted by the group that they're in. Habits of thinking, habits of anything from the posture of how they sit to the slang that they use gets shaped. At least in a good classroom, it gets shaped and it can have a big effect on how a child learns. So if they come from a broken household and they try to learn online, I think they're going to have problems. But if they come from a strong household with good values and they try to learn online, they have a fighting chance of doing very well.
There's a question that I'm dying to ask, because it's my pet question actually, and it comes from Ross Shepston. He says to the Legal Eagles, which I assume is Mark Oppenheimer, what is the future of the bar? Is working remotely a viable option for advocates? And Mark, before you answer this question, if I can just pose something to consider, which is whether or not the current physical structure of the bar regarding this requirement that we all hold chambers, these massive fancy individual offices, whether those costs and operating costs of the legal profession as it's currently structured actually land up causing an impediment to justice, because we are all so busy paying off our operating expenses that we are less able to provide, for example, pro bono and reduced fee work, which I think is going to become incredibly important. So I think Ross's question is fantastic. So what is your response there?
I suppose in some ways I've been a little ahead of the curve on this, in that my practice has been running digitally for years. So lawyers have a reputation for being incredibly conservative in the sense that they don't like change and they don't like adopting new technologies. So I remember when I started out, one of the more senior members of the bar wouldn't write an email. He would dictate it to a secretary who would then write the email for him. That's how tech afraid he was. I've been running everything off of an iPad whenever I go to court, and all my cases are totally digital. The purpose of chambers is really to kind of have a legal community in some senses. So we realized that we were better together because the law is so vast that we cannot know it all. And we need to be able to knock on each other's doors to exchange ideas. And I think that physicality has been quite important, and also for a way of sort of exchanging work through some senses. And what we need to do is sort of embrace a digital community. So it's become quite evident to everyone quite forcibly that you can be in touch with your colleagues in a manner like this. You can have a Zoom meeting, that you don't need to meet face to face to exchange ideas. So I think a lot of people are going to be forced into this bold new era. Courts have been interesting on this front. There's been a move towards digitization there as well. And there is no reason why you can't have a hearing on Zoom. That all you really require for a legal hearing is a judge. That judges have for years been running hearings at 2 o'clock in the morning for urgents out of their bedrooms and over the phone. So, this can be done. We can ensure that justice proceeds during this time. And there will be more calls for justice. We're going to see increasing numbers of rights abuses. We know, as I say, that that the South African Defence Force has often acted in an abusive manner during this time. That I think 8 people have died at the hands of the police. And so the people will need to go to court so that their rights can be vindicated. And so we need to be ready to do that. But we don't necessarily have to be in a physical location together. We can have already, the criminal courts have been capacitated with video streaming footage. So people who are awaiting trial can testify from their cells and that can be seen. So, there are structures in place to keep the wheels of justice turning. And I think it's very important that we embrace that as rapidly as we can while trying to keep our legal community together.
And then speaking of rights, David and Sarah has asked, sorry if I got the pronunciation of the surname incorrect there, but he says, do you think the restrictions on free speech during the C-19 crisis are justified? Should people who spread disinformation be criminalized, and what are the implications? Yeah, I can't access the rest of it, but I think the tenor of the question is clear. And if I can maybe just extend that to this issue of our cell phones being tapped and us being digitally monitored.
Yes. So as I said, that document that I've written tries to log the rights restrictions that are in place, and we are seeing very severe restrictions on our privacy. You have a constitutional right not to have your communications intercepted by the state. What the regulations do on the privacy angle is to say that, that cell phone providers and ISPs can be compelled to provide your location and your movement. Now, the purpose of that is to try and, I assume, track someone who has COVID and to see who they've interacted with so that you can then run track and trace programs and quarantine the virus. So there is let's say, a noble purpose to it. Now, the worry is that there will always be noble purposes. That the state could say, well, imagine how good we'd be at stopping crime if only we could just monitor everyone's movements. Now, there are some quite good measures in the regulations, in the sense that anyone who has been monitored must be told they've been monitored. All that information must be deleted by the state after 6 weeks. So there are some protections in place, and I think that that's important. As I say, once the crisis is over, we need to really move back to a flourishing free society. On the question of speech, the regulations talk about if you intend to deceive someone about COVID or government efforts to address it, that is punishable. Now, there's a difference between spreading false information and doing so intentionally. I think a lot of people are going to innocently spread false information. So, for example, just today, there was sort of messages going around that President Ramaphosa would be addressing the nation at 4 o'clock. I assume that when people spread that information, they weren't trying to deceive anyone. They thought it was true, and that's why they spread it. There will be other pernicious actors who will be trying to sow dissent and chaos, and there might be reasons to try and quell that. But we must be wary. Some people will act innocently. They will say things that are false. So generally, my view on the importance of allowing free speech is that the way that you can sharpen your sword and work out what is true is by clashing it against things that are false. So, for example, we've seen lots of talk about 5G being a mechanism for spreading COVID. Now, we live in this environment where it's quite easy for us to access true information. And very quickly, if anyone sort of applies their mind to that question, they're going to know that that's a totally bogus statement, that you're going to have conspiracy theorists like David Icke spewing all sorts of nonsense. But we need to trust that people are rational and they're able to sort of interrogate those ideas and that truth will win out. Now, what's difficult, of course, is when people's rational capacities are impeded by panic. And I think there may be times when it becomes reasonable to restrict speech in this environment, which would be totally unreasonable outside of a pandemic. We're not always going to get it right. The way that we can evaluate the reasonableness of our actions is twofold. The one is, given the information we had at the time, was that a reasonable thing to do? And the other one is, after all the evidence has come in, was it reasonable for us to have done what we did at the time? Now, all we have is the current moment and the current information. We're going to make errors. And we're going to have to sort of think about these twin ideals of the one of saving lives and the other one about protecting the quality of our life. And partly what's important in the quality of life is protecting our freedoms, which were hard won. As I say, the cost of freedom is constant vigilance. And so we need to keep an eye on the restrictions that are being there and try and sound the alarm bells when they start to look very unreasonable. And a good example of a restriction being lifted was there was a blunt tool used for parents that are separated or divorced and who share custody. And the original ruling was that if you have the kids during lockdown, they are stuck with you. You cannot hand them back to the parent. That rule has since changed. A couple of days ago, the view was, okay, fine. If you have a court order or an agreement to transport the kids and you have good reason to believe that the other household doesn't have someone with COVID, then you can transport your kids. So because we have this, one of the overriding principles in a lot of common law countries is that you have to do what's in the best interest of a child. And often it's going to be in the best interest of a child. They see both of their parents. So we're starting to see a kind of reasonable accommodation being there. We may find that for other rights restrictions.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time now, so we can't take any more questions, unfortunately. But with all these questions, what we're going to do is we're going to start addressing them in our future talks, where we'll go into some of these specific topics in far more detail. On the economy and maybe further on rights and health and politics and that type of thing. But if you guys would be able to just start giving us some concluding comments now, just starting with Mark Simonian, just so that we can start closing off.
Well, I mean, the only way to conclude after such apocalyptic predictions is that always look on the bright side of life. It's there. It's many of you have been through very, very bad times in your lives, and you understand that there's always tomorrow. And as I said earlier, and we discussed it, plan for the worst, but hope for the best. You have your friends, you have your family, you have your community. Develop deeper ties with those people. It is going to pay off for you in many ways. You try to use this crisis as an opportunity to deepen who you are as a person and to start to put aside some of the more the less important parts of your life and parts of your character that maybe don't serve you, and get down to the more serious parts that do. In the crisis, there are many moments of happiness and opportunity, and sometimes we don't know where those are because things get so bad that we can't see that tomorrow is going to be another day. But I've been personally through in family illnesses and deaths and a number of tragedies, and where I thought the world was going to end, and somehow it popped up again. So I hope all of you keep that hope alive and keep agile and keep your options open as much as possible and think on your feet. And hopefully we will all have a conversation about this someday, a few years from now, and people can share their stories about how great tragedy in the world changed their lives to the better and made something magical happen in their life that they never would have happened because of their previous way of living.
Thank you. And then Mark Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I think there's some excellent sentiments there. This is a time that will test our characters, and some people will, as I say, reevaluate what matters in their lives. I would think that if you've spent a lot of time, involved in meaningless activities, that you may regret the little time that you had on Earth, and now we'll see it as an opportunity to sort of change that path and do things that are truly meaningful. If you're speaking of the sort of looking on the bright side of life, we're heading into Easter, and I'd say that the best Easter movie to watch is, of course, the movie that featured that song, being The Life of Brian. So you can whistle along to the end sequence in that.
Great suggestion.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Erin, any final comments from you?
Yeah, I'm pretty much along the same lines as the two Marks. I know that every time I go through personal upheaval, my father's favorite saying is, "The sun will come up tomorrow." So I suppose the message there is just endurance personally, and I would just encourage people to do whatever they can to share whatever knowledge they have that might benefit the people around them. I think that at the moment, that's what the society needs the most is collaboration. It doesn't cost anyone anything. You don't need any hard capital. So if you do have knowledge or insights that can help people, I would encourage everyone to share that. And I think that's my concluding remark. And thank you very much to both our panelists. I took a lot out of this evening. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, both Marks. That was fantastic. And sorry to all of those questions we didn't get time to answer, but we are going to be using them and use them as guides for our next talks, which we'll be having hopefully regularly every Thursday night. We might not make it every Thursday, but we're going to give it a try. And thank you everybody for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this. And have a fantastic evening and a fantastic Easter.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.